In the blistering August heat of 1840 Louisiana, the air hung thick with the perfume of rot and resurrection, a perfume I would later come to recognize as the scent of blood and blooming jasmine. Two things that define the Bellefontaine legacy more than anything else. The swamps around St. Landry Parish are not dead, though they appear to be. They breathe in a way that unnerves the living, slow and heavy, like a body asleep but not at rest. That was how I felt the first time I stepped off the coach that brought me down from Baton Rouge. A body in a waking dream, summoned by a letter that arrived folded inside my grandmother's last diary. The letter had no return address, only my name in a looping script that seemed pressed more than written, as though the writer had carved my name into the paper with a bone dipped in ink. "You must know the truth," it began, "about the women you came from." The handwriting made my hands shake, not because I believed in fate or curses or bloodlines, but because some part of me did. My grandmother, dead and buried for 10 years, had told no stories of her youth. Not to me, not to my father, not to anyone. The silence in our family wasn't passive. It was enforced. I never heard the name Bellefontaine until I turned 30, and that name, that cursed name, echoed back through that letter like a drumbeat from the past. The only thing my grandmother ever told me about Louisiana was this: no child should ever be born in that house. At the time, I laughed. Thought she meant the stifling heat, the bad roads, the mosquitoes. Now I know she meant something else entirely. The Bellefontaine women were midwives. That was the word everyone used, midwives. But the letter said something more. It said they were the first and the last faces many ever saw. That line clung to me. The implication wasn't just birth. It was death, too. I remember standing on the edge of the Bellefontaine property, staring at the gray clapper house half-sunk in kudzu and mold, and feeling like I was staring at the soft, open mouth of a grave. I had come to learn about my past, to fill in the blanks of the family that refused to speak. But what I found was not just silence. It was a story waiting to be heard. A story soaked in the floorboards, tangled in the Spanish moss, buried in the still warm ground behind the house where the headstones bore no names. The local driver refused to go further than the main road. "That's the witch house," he muttered, spitting on the dirt. "You want trouble, you go knocking there." I didn't believe in witches. I still don't. But I believe in women who hold power the world never meant for them to have. I believe in legacy. I believe in the burden of inherited guilt. I stepped over the threshold of that house, and the air changed, went still, as though it were listening. The house didn't creak. It sighed. Inside, it was a museum of something that didn't want to be remembered. Dried herbs hung from the beams. Every corner had candles, long melted into the shape of dripping fingers. The walls were lined with portraits, all women, all stern, all wearing the same expression I saw in the mirror later that night. Knowing and tired. On the mantel above the cold fireplace was a single object, a brass bowl with dried blood crusted at the bottom. I should have left then, but I didn't, because beneath all the dread I felt something else. A pull, a grief I couldn't explain. That house had held the cries of hundreds of babies, and the last breaths of their mothers. That house had seen decisions made in the name of tradition, justice, and secrecy. That house had known screams and silence. I opened the first drawer in the sideboard and found a ledger, names, dates, all written in the same looping script. Each birth recorded like a ceremony. Some names had small symbols beside them, stars, crosses, red ink. I didn't understand them then. I would come to understand them far too well. As I stood there, I imagined my grandmother's cries echoing through these rooms. Imagined my great-grandmother's blood staining the same floorboards. I was not just reading history. I was standing inside it. And history does not like to be disturbed. A gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me. I did not scream. Instead, I whispered the only name I had ever feared, and the only name I now needed to understand, Bellefontaine. The morning after I first entered the Bellefontaine house, I awoke not in the narrow cot I had laid myself on, but sprawled across the dusty parlor floor, the faint imprint of the ledgers covered pressed into my cheek, as though the way of my family's history had literally branded me. Light filtered weakly through the warped shutters, casting the entire room in bruised golden shadow, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that I was no longer just a visitor. I was a participant. I had stepped into something larger than memory, larger than blood. I had stepped into a system built by women whose hands never trembled when they held life or death in their palms. That realization sat with me heavily as I turned back to the ledger. Its pages so brittle they crackled like fire with every turn. Each name entered with perfect penmanship. Each date marked with care, and beside some of the names, symbols like tiny runes of judgment. A crescent moon, a dagger, a weeping eye. I didn't know what they meant yet, but I knew they weren't decoration. They were decisions. What haunted me more than the symbols were the patterns. The same surnames repeating over generations, often mother and daughter side by side. Like birth and inheritance were chained to each other. No woman here chose her path. It was etched into her bones the moment she took her first breath under this roof. And what a terrible roof it was. I spent the day exploring what remained of the house, a crumbling upstairs nursery, long abandoned but unervingly tidy, with rows of hand-sewn swaddles folded into baskets, a pantry lined with jars of dried herbs and medical tools too precise to be for home use alone, and the back room always locked, with a smell of old iron and dried lavender leaked from beneath the door like a promise. I didn't try to open it yet. I wasn't ready. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a letter I found in a child's music box. Still wound, still ready to play a lullaby that had outlived the child it was meant for. The letter was addressed to my dearest Emily, dated 1793, and it read like a confession hidden in the folds of gentleness. You are born a strong stock, my girl. You will deliver life with the strength of your mother and her mother before her. But you must also learn to close the door when the time comes. Not every cry is meant to be heard. Not every breath should be drawn. We are not angels, Emily. We are arbiters. We are the threshold. That word, threshold, froze me, because that was what this house truly was, wasn't it? A threshold between mercy and cruelty, between justice and convenience, between life and its refusal. I looked down at my own hands, slender like my grandmother's, and wondered if they too carried a memory of such decisions. The emotional weight of it was unbearable, and yet somehow familiar, as if I'd always felt this pressure, but never known its source. And it made me furious. Furious at the women who passed it on like a sacred relic. Furious at the silence that had kept my father in the dark. Furious at the fact that even now, sitting in the crumbling kitchen of a forgotten legacy, part of me felt pride. That was the most terrifying thing. I understood it. Not just the record keeping, but the logic in a world that offered women so little control. Perhaps this power, over who came into it and how, was the only sovereignty they ever truly had. Still, understanding is not absolution. I closed the music box, folded the letter, and looked at the family tree I had begun drawing from the ledger. The branches forked like veins, and each generation bled into the next. There were no breaks, no renegades, no one who had walked away. Until, maybe now, because the more I read, the more I understood that my grandmother had fled for a reason, not out of fear, but as protest. Her silence was not cowardice. It was defiance. And if I was her blood, then maybe my return was not just curiosity. Maybe it was confrontation. The air in the house shifted then, as though it had recognized something awakening in me. I didn't flinch. I opened the ledger again and kept reading. I needed to know which woman had first marked a name in red ink. I needed to know how far back this ritual selection had begun, because buried beneath all this documentation, all this sterile notation, was a truth more human and heartbreaking than any ghost story. That these women, the Bellefontaines, were not monsters. They were daughters, wives, sisters, midwives. They were women born into the sacred trust of delivering life. And somewhere along the line, they had learned that sometimes taking was easier than letting it ruin what remained. That realization, more than anything, is what broke me. I had come here searching for answers. But what I found was that the answers were not mysteries to solve. They were griefs to carry. And they were mine now. It was 3 days after I arrived that I witnessed my first birth inside the Bellefontaine house. Not as a participant, not even as a helper, but as a horrified observer to a reenactment of pain and purpose so visceral it scorched itself into my memory with the permanence of fire. I had not planned to be there for it. I had only returned to house after walking the perimeter of the overgrown cemetery behind it, where tiny white stones marked the resting places of unnamed infants, stones so small they looked like forgotten teeth scattered across the earth. I had been walking in circles, trying to piece together what kind of lives the Bellefontaine women had lived that allowed them to make such definitive, brutal choices and still believe they were doing good, or at least necessary work. But when I stepped back into the house, I heard a sound that didn't belong to history. It was low, wet guttural, a moan maybe, a cry. At first, I thought it might have been a raccoon or some other swamp creature trapped in the floorboards. But then I heard a voice thick with pain and panic. Not yet, please, not yet. And that was when I saw her, the woman. She had come into the back without me noticing, barefoot, sweat-drenched, and very much in labor. Her face was unfamiliar, but unmistakably desperate. She clutched her belly as though the weight of the child inside was about to split her open. "Help!" she whispered to no one. I didn't know where else to go. And even though I had no idea who she was, or why she had come to this long-abandoned house, something in my blood answered her. I ran to her without thinking. Her knees buckled, and I caught her. She smelled of copper and heat and fear. I laid her down on the old birthing cot in the back room. I hadn't dared enter before. And with trembling hands, I pulled back the cloth curtain that separated that sacred, haunted space from the rest of the house. The room was precisely as it had been left generations ago, sterile in its own rustic, cruel way. The walls were lined with shelves holding aged linens, blunt scissors, metal bowls still tarnished from time. The woman screamed then, a long, breaking wail that filled the house like a siren. I tried to call for help. My phone had no signal, no service, no hope of reaching the modern world. We were alone. The only tools I had were the ones left behind by the women who had delivered hundreds, maybe thousands, before me. And so I moved on instinct. Not medical training, not knowledge, just instinct rooted in the stories I'd read, the symbols I'd studied, the letters that told me what was expected when the threshold between life and death opened. She gripped my wrist and begged, "Don't let me die." I nodded though my whole body shook. The baby was crowning. I breathed in once, twice, and reached for the same brass bowl I had seen on the fireplace mantel, rinsed it with water from a cracked jug, and prepared for something I was not remotely ready for. The next 30 minutes were agony. For her, for me, for whatever part of the house, still remembered the cries of the many who had labored in that room. She screamed until her voice broke, clawed the cot until her fingernails split, and when the baby finally slipped free into my hands, slick and silent, I thought I might collapse. It didn't cry at first. It just lay there, wet and still, and I froze, unsure whether to grieve or act. Then it gasped one sharp, wet breath, and the sound echoed like thunder. The woman sobbed with relief, and I wrapped the baby in the nearest clean cloth I could find. It was only then, in the quiet aftermath, that I saw her eyes, wide, terrified, fixated not on the baby, but on me. "Don't tell them," she whispered. "Don't let them take her." Her voice trembled, not with pain, but with remembered horror. "They took my sister's child, said she was unworthy, said she was born under a curse sign." Her body shook with exhaustion and fear. I tried to calm her, to explain I wasn't one of them, not really, but she didn't believe me. Maybe because she saw something in my face I didn't yet know was there. The resemblance, the inheritance, the quiet understanding that I now knew what it meant to be part of the threshold. I stayed with her until nightfall. I cleaned her wounds, fed her broth from an old tin, and held the baby while she slept. But as I cradled the child, something unbearable unfolded inside me. Not supernatural, not magical, but real. The crushing knowledge that I had done what the Bellefontaines did. I had delivered life. And in that moment, I understood why they stayed, why they obeyed, why they believed. Because once you bring life into this world with your own hands, it changes you. You begin to believe you have the right to decide what happens next. That's the danger. That's the beginning of the corruption. That's the seed. when the woman left the next morning, vanishing back into the swamp with her baby and her silence. She didn't thank me. She didn't look back. She just disappeared. And I stood in the empty house, surrounded by the ghosts of pain that were not supernatural but human, pain born of choices, traditions, legacies. I didn't know her name, but I knew what she feared. I knew what I had almost become. And that fear, more than anything, would haunt me. The morning after the woman and her newborn vanished into the humid silence of the swamp, I returned to the ledger, now more than just an artifact. It was a map of moral erosion, a scripture of choices masquerading as duty, and as I turned fragile pages with a care bordering on reverence, I understood why it had survived so long untouched. It was not simply a record. It was a confession bound in ink, a legacy of selective memory and quiet violence that the Bellefontaine women had carried, like scripture across generations. Each name listed there, scrawled in slanted cursive, the kind that could only belong to someone who was both educated and devout, was more than a birth. It was a story of consequence, of criteria, of judgment meted out without trial or testimony. The deeper I read, the more horrifying the patterns became. Next to certain names, always women, there were marks, not letters or medical notations, but symbols inked in red, so faint now they looked like dry blood diluted by time. A crescent, an eye, a single that inside a circle. But it wasn't the symbols that undid me. It was what accompanied them. Dates with no following entry, names of mothers with no listed infants, records that ended abruptly without the customary blessing or note of survival. These were not accidents. These were omissions that screamed through their absence. The Bellefontaines had not only recorded births, they had documented decisions, deaths, choices made behind closed doors, choices made by women who had convinced themselves they were preserving something sacred, or perhaps protecting something too fragile to survive scrutiny. As I traced my finger along the names, a chill swept through me, not from fear, but recognition. I saw my grandmother's name, Marguerite Bellefontaine, written once in the standard line, delivered female child 1935, and then again in red, consultation September 1937. No child listed, no mother listed, just her name and a date and a symbol I had not seen elsewhere in the book, a hollow square. I flipped pages frantically, trying to find another like it, but there were none. She was the only one. I slammed the book shut and felt bile rise in my throat. What had she done? What had she seen? I needed answers, but the only person who might have known was now ash in the earth, buried far from this house and its history. I searched the shelves, tore through boxes of brittle papers, scanned every label on every bottle, until finally, tucked behind a rusted tin of lying gauze, I found a bundle of aged documents bound in twine. Inside were fragments of letters, torn pages from journals, and a folded piece of parchment with a wax seal bearing the Bellefontaine crest. A pair of hands cradling a circle. Inside, written in a firm but trembling hand, were the words that would end what innocence I had left. Not all who labor are meant to live. Not all who live are meant to continue. When one crosses a line, the duty falls to us to correct the imbalance. This is our burden. This is our justice. My chest hollowed out as I read those words again and again, the ink dark as dried blood. I realized that this family had never truly been about midwifery in the sense the world understood it. They were not caretakers of life. They were guardians of scale, only they believed they had the right to balance. They saw life not as sacred, but conditional. And when those conditions were not met, by birth defect, by shame, by perceived moral failure, they intervened, with silence, with efficiency, with hands that both delivered and ended. I returned to the ledger one last time that day, now no longer afraid of what I might find, but sick with the certainty that whatever I learned next would only confirm what I already felt deep in my bones, that I came from a line of women who had blurred the line between mercy and murder so thoroughly that even they could no longer tell the difference. I looked at the ink, at the pages, at the names, and I saw not records but gravestones, a cemetery of the forgotten, and I was standing at its gate, holding the key, wondering if I had already begun to open it. It was on the 5th evening, just as the swamp outside the Bellefontaine house began to hiss with the breath of insects and distant birdsong turned to silence, that I uncovered the full weight of what the Bellefontaine women had truly done, and the twist that would shatter any remaining illusions I held about duty or maternal grace or the notion of birth as inherently sacred. For beneath the layers of antiseptic language and ritualistic recording lay a truth so brutal and methodical it could not be mistaken for anything but chosen execution, cloaked in a language of necessity and tradition. And it came to me not through another letter or record, but through the journal of a woman named Delphine, my great-great-grandmother, who wrote with chilling calm about a practice she referred only as judgment births, a term that before then had held no meaning to me, but now glowed on the page with an inescapable finality that made my skin crawl. And it began with this line, "Some lives are not meant to cross the threshold, and it is our duty to stand in the doorway, hands ready, eyes clear." And from that point onward, the pages unfolded with a cold arithmetic, a system not of healing but selection, where midwives bore not just the tools of labor but the authority of finality, where they weighed the sins of the mother, poverty, promiscuity, mixed bloodlines, disobedience to family order, rumors of madness, prior miscarriages, or a simple failure to conform to the Bellefontaine vision of purity against the fate of the child. And if the mother was found wanting, the ritual was quiet, clinical, almost compassionate in its detachment. The cord would not be tied. The child would be held upside down a moment too long. A breath would be delayed until it was too late. And then the body, still warm, would be handed over wrapped in linen. No accusations made, no grief interrupted, only the soft, devastating sentence of she was too weak to make it. And sometimes when the judgment was harsher, when the mother herself was viewed as a threat, not just a flawed vessel, but a danger to the lineage or the community, the delivery became the execution of both, and the tools once used for cutting umbilical cords were used to silence screams, and the ledger marked it only as complication, never as punishment. And this, Delphine wrote, was what separated the Bellefontaine women from mere midwives. They were not only bringers of life, they were its gatekeepers, its final, arbiters, protectors of code no one outside the family ever read. And as I sat there trembling, the weight of my breath clawing in my throat, I realized the red symbols in the ledger were not just warnings or notations. They were sentences passed down through hands that believed they were preserving something vital. And the worst part was that they believed it was mercy, that ending a life at birth was less cruel than allowing it to endure in what they deemed a world of suffering. And suddenly, the story of my grandmother's silence made brutal, devastating sense. Not because she feared ghosts or curses, but because she had seen too much of what mercy looked like in the wrong hands. Hands like hers, hands like mine, hands born to deliver but raised to decide. And the final page of Delphine's journal, stained with something dark and rusted at the edges, held only one line: "May God forgive the ones we saved and those we spared." And I sat frozen, the knowledge anchoring me like a stone to the floorboards, the smell of the house turning metallic in my nose. The images of every woman who passed through those doors now recast in a crueler, colder light, not victims of mystery, but philosophy, of a deeply rooted belief in maternal omnipotence taken to its most logical and horrific end. And I knew then that what I had stumbled into was not a family secret. It was a historical atrocity buried under generations of euphemism. And I, by blood, by choice, by presence, was now a part of it. I first saw her at the edge of the swamp, standing so still that I thought she might be carved from the very cypress roots that twisted around her feet, a pale cotton dress clinging to her like old gauze and hair that hung long and damp like river moss. And when she turned to look at me with those eyes, dark, hollow, impossibly tired, I didn't speak because something about her presence silenced me in a way no revelation or horror from a Bellefontaine house ever had. And as I stepped closer, my feet sinking slightly into the mud, I realized she wasn't a ghost or a vision or some product of my fraying nerves. She was real, human, and scarred in ways that had nothing to do with the flesh. And when she finally spoke, her voice cracked like bark peel from old wood. "You're from a house, aren't you?" And I nodded slowly, carefully, not yet sure whether to claim or reject that terrible inheritance. And she said, "Then you need to know what they did to me." And that was how I came to sit across from her on a rotting wooden bench beneath the drape of willow branches, the air thick with the smell of standing water and old secrets, as she told me her story in halting fragments, each word wrung from her like blood from a wound that never closed. How she had been 17 when she found out she was pregnant, unmarried, Her lover, a man twice her age and gone without a word when she told him, and her own mother, who had given birth under the care of the Bellefontaines, insisted she go to them for help because they don't judge, they help. And so she went barefoot and terrified, carrying a child and the weight of shame so heavy she couldn't lift her eyes to the women who opened the door. And they welcomed her, led her inside, gave her broth and warm towels, and told her she would be cared for. But it wasn't care they gave her, not the kind that heals. It was the kind that watches, assesses, measures. And when the labor came, it was swift and merciless, and not once did they let her hold her child. Not once did they let her see its face. And when she asked where her baby was, they said only she was not strong. And the way they said it wasn't sad, it was final, like a verdict passed and carried out. And they sent her away with a blanket and a bottle of tonic for the bleeding, never once calling her by name, never once asking if she had someone to return to. And when she told her mother, the woman went pale and whispered that it was probably for the best, and that was when she understood that her child had not died because she was weak, but because she had been weighed and found wanting, because somewhere in that house, in a room she was never allowed to enter, someone had made a decision she would never get to question, and she lived with that knowledge like a stone in her chest for years, until one day, through a letter passed her in secret by a former Bellefontaine girl who had fled the family, she learned that the child had not died at all, had been taken and given to another woman, one deemed more fit, more worthy. And the last thing she knew was that the child was living in another parish under another name, never knowing the woman who had borne her. And at that point in her story, she stopped speaking, just stared across the water like she might see her daughter's face reflected there. And when I asked her why she had told me this, why now, she said, because someone needs to remember us, not just the children they chose, but the mothers they erased. And in that moment, something in me broke, not with anger, but with the crushing awareness that the Bellefontaines hadn't just ended lives. They had stolen them, redirected them, rewritten them like narratives they had the exclusive right to edit. And I thanked her, not because it felt appropriate, but because there was nothing else to give. And as I turned to leave, she said quietly, they didn't wear black. They wore white. That's how they fooled us. They made death look like purity. And I walked back to the Swan with that line echoing in my head like a funeral bell, knowing that the stories I've been collecting were not just confessions or historical curiosities. They were indictments, testimonies, bleeding evidence that the women I descended from had not just been midwives, not even executioners, but editors of fate, and that their greatest crime was not silence, but certainty. The key was hidden behind a loose brick in the hearth, wrapped in a bundle of oilcloth that smelled of mildew and rosemary, as though time itself had tried to preserve its secrecy with equal parts rot and reverence. And it was only after I found the key, guided not by instinct, but by a single line scrawled in the margin of Delphine's journal, the room remained sealed, for the weight of his memory is heavier than any lock, that I stood in front of the small door at the back of the house, the one that never seemed to open no matter how hard I pushed, the one I convinced myself wasn't important until every story, every symbol, every scream I now carried made it unavoidable, and the moment I turned the key, the click echoed to the house like the crack of bone, sharp and final, and the door creaked open to reveal not horror, not gore, not some forgotten chamber of madness, but something far more chilling in its precision, a space untouched by time, orderly and immaculate, with walls lined in white cloth, shelves holding surgical instruments polished to a dull gleam, jars labeled in careful script with Latin names for roots and poisons, and in the center, an old birthing chair, wooden and worn smooth from decades of use, the seat stained in a way no amount of scrubbing could erase. And as I stepped inside, I realized this was not a secret dungeon. It was a sanctuary built for decisions, for rituals disguised as medical necessity. And the most unnerving part was how utterly sterile it felt, how devoid of rage or emotion, as though the room itself had accepted its role as judge and executioner long before I was ever born. And on the far wall, beneath a faded tapestry of St. Agatha, the patron of midwives and martyrs, was a cabinet, and inside were rows of small objects, each one tagged with a date and a single initial, woven baby caps, locks of hair, bracelets made of thread and dried herbs, tiny teeth kept in glass vials, and I felt the weight of each item like a punch to the chest, because these were not mementos, they were trophies, tokens of lives decided upon, of infants chosen or discarded, and beside them sat a second ledger, thinner than the first but bound in the same cracked leather, and when I opened it, The first page read simply, "Sanctioned terminations," and my hands trembled so violently I could barely hold the pages steady as I scanned entry after entry, each one brief and emotionless. Male, breach, mother hysterical, deemed unfit. Infant expired during extraction. Female born silent, condition suggests mental defect. Family refused disclosure. Twins, one removed. Other smothered for balance. Mother sedated. No memory recorded. And the matter-of-fact cruelty of those words stole the air from my lungs, not just because of what they meant, but because of how they were written, with the cold clarity of procedure, as though ending a life was no more morally significant than setting a bone. And it became clear to me then that this room had not been a last resort. It had been a routine, a sacred act repeated so often it lost its horror for those who performed it. And I looked around at the implements on the table: forceps, clamps, gauze, a rusted cradle that looked more ceremonial than functional. And I saw not tools of healing, but instrument of erasure. And suddenly I couldn't stand the smell, the quiet, the weight of everything that had happened here. And I staggered back, bile rising in my throat, until I was at the doorway again, staring into the house that once felt like a riddle I might solve, but now felt like a wound that would never close. And as I looked at the faded floral wallpaper and the beams, darkened by time, I imagined how many women had walked through this house believing they were entering a place of care, not knowing they had crossed into a court where their bodies would be judged without trial, where their children would be assessed like crops, kept or culled depending on criteria, whispered in candlelight. And I felt an ache so deep in my ribs, I pressed my hand there, try to contain it, trying to stay upright, because it wasn't just the history that haunted me now. It was the knowing, the inheritance, the awful realization that I carried their blood and their decisions. And somewhere in the marrow of me, a question waited that I didn't want to face. If it had been me in that room, with that authority, with that legacy, would I have done the same? I thought the worst was behind me after stepping out of the ritual room. Thought that understanding the methods and machinery of what the Bellefontaines had done was the end of the horror. But I was wrong, because the deeper ache, the true sickness, was not found in the tools or ledgers or the preserved tokens of terminated lives, but in the testimonies of those who had lived through it, who carried the judgment not as death but as inheritance. And in the weeks that followed I traveled from parish to parish, following faded letters and whisper-thin rumors, tracking down the women who bore the Bellefontaine name or shared bloodlines too deluded to claim openly, and what I found wasn't defiance or rebellion or even guilt. It was pride, a cold and quiet pride wrapped in euphemisms like tradition and discipline and the burden of the knowing. And in backyards, in kitchens that smelled of gumbo and rust, I sat across from granddaughters and great-nieces who spoke of the old ways, with a kind of reverence, who believed that the Bellefontaine women had served as the spine of moral order in communities where men could not be trusted to govern the flesh. And they spoke with unsettling calm about the scale, a system passed from mouth to mouth, generation to generation, never written but always obeyed, where every pregnancy was weighed not just for its biological risks but for its social ones, where a mother's standing, her behavior, her relationships, her reputation, and even her mental health became part of a calculus too subjective to be fair, but too sacred to question. And I began to see that the ledger I held was only the surface of something far more insidious, a philosophy that had burrowed its way into family dinners and church pews and mother-daughter talks, where instead of condemning what the Bellefontaines had done, they celebrated it as justice cloaked in mercy, a tradition that kept the weak from suffering and the strong from being deluded by chaos. And I remember one woman in particular, an elderly midwife named Cecile, who sat in her wicker chair with a rosary in one hand and a long scar curling across her neck like a faded memory, and she looked me in the eye and said, "We did what was necessary. There are worse fates than dying at birth. We spared them." I asked her if she had ever regretted it, and she said, "Only when they screamed," and that answer gutted me, because it wasn't the cruelty she regretted. It was the interruption of silence, the moment when a baby refused to go quietly, and I realized then that the Bellefontaine doctrine wasn't just about control. It was about containment, about making sure pain didn't spill out into the world where it might cause more suffering. And in that logic, every decision was a kindness, every silencing, an act of protection. And that was what chilled me most, not the deaths, but the justifications, the calm, the unwavering belief that they were saving not just individuals, but the entire bloodline from decay. And as I returned to house, to the ledger, to the artifacts that once made me tremble, I saw them differently, not as relics of evil, but as tools of a system that was never questioned because the questions themselves were never allowed. And I sat at the kitchen table and tried to write down everything I had learned, but the words felt slippery, too small for the enormity of what the Bellefontaine women had truly done. And for the first time since arriving, I began to weep, not for the dead, but for the living, for every woman who bore a child only to have it taken, for every daughter who grew up believing that her worth was not in her heart or her strength, but in whether she could produce the right kind of life. And in that moment, I knew that the legacy of judgment was not buried. It was active, pulsing, waiting in the bones of every woman who had ever been told her body was not her own. And I understood that I was not just a witness to history. I was its product, its vessel, and perhaps its last inheritor. I found the archive hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the upstairs nursery, the very room where I had once imagined soft lullabies and blankets, scented with lavender, but now understood as a staging ground, a waiting chamber for decisions that would echo long after cries had stopped. And beneath the cracked wood, wrapped in a bundle of cloth once pale, but now stained the color of old bone, were letters, hundreds of them, folded tightly, bound with twine, and marked only with initials and dates, as though the writers feared even in death to speak their names aloud. And I sat there for hours in the fading light, my legs numb, my breath shallow, unfolding testimony after testimony, each one written by a woman whose child had vanished, whose body had been used not just as a vessel for life, but as a filter for judgment. And with every page I read, the picture became clearer, more horrifying, more human, the heartbreak, the shame, the confusion, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, they were wrong, that maybe their baby had survived and was taken, not lost. And some of the letters were simple cries into the void, lines like, "I still hear him breathing," or "They told me she was too small, but I saw her fingers move," while others were long, methodical records of inconsistencies, patterns, strange silences and whispers overheard during labor, a piece of jewelry that went missing only to reappear months later on another woman's child, a midwife who refused to meet the mother's eyes, and through all of it there pulsed one single, inescapable thread. The knowing, not the suspicion, not the speculation, but the knowing, deep and unbearable, that a life had been taken without explanation, and it was in this archive, more than any ledger or journal or surgical tool, that the Bellefontaine legacy was laid bare, because here was the truth the official records tried to bleach away, that behind every complication was a mother with memory, a woman with breath and blood and scream still caught in her throat. And I came to understand that these letters had never been sent, not truly, because there was nowhere for them to go. No church would hear them. No court would investigate. No family would risk the scandal of believing them. And so the attic became their cathedral, the floorboards their confessional, and I read every word with reverence that bordered on nausea until I came upon one written in the exact same hand as the one that had sent me the letter that started this all, the same curling script, delicate but firm, and it was signed only M, and in it my grandmother wrote not about death, but about defiance, how she had refused to carry out one judgment, how she had hidden a child that was meant to be taken, how she had smuggled the baby to a nearby parish and forged a birth certificate with a priest who owed her silence. And as I read those words, my stomach turned, because the baby she described was born in 1937 to a woman named Rosalie, marked with a hollow square, the only one in the ledger, and suddenly I knew with a sick, spinning certainty that the child had been spared, had been passed on, had been raised without ever knowing the truth, and that child was my father, and I, his daughter, was never meant to exist, and everything I was, my name, my life, my future, was the product of a single act of rebellion, a fracture in the Bellefontaine code, a ripple in their perfected system of control. And in that moment, the house around me felt different, not just haunted but aware, as though it had been waiting for me to find this, to understand, to absorb the contradiction of being both born from resistance and heir to a legacy of harm. And I pressed a letter to my chest and wept, not because I finally knew who I was, but because I finally understood what I was meant to carry. The woman who waited for me at the river's edge was the last living Bellefontaine by name. Though her face had long been scrubbed from any family photo, her story buried under decades of silence and whispered shame, and it took me weeks to find her, following leads through back porches and forgotten parish records until finally I stood at the bayou, watching her silhouette sway beneath the Spanish moss like something plucked from memory itself. And when I called her name, Colette, she didn't flinch, only turned her face slowly, the lines in her skin deep as roots, her eyes pale and sharp, and said, "You look like her." And I knew she meant my grandmother, Marguerite, the one who defied the lineage just once, the one who had given me my life by denying another's end. And Colette motioned for me to sit, and for a long while we just listened to the river, the way it swallowed every sound, until she spoke in a voice brittle but steady. "You found the archive," and I nodded, unable to speak, the weight of everything I had read still pressing against my chest. And she sighed. A long, exhausted thing began. "I was there the night it happened. 1937. I assisted. It was supposed to be simple. The girl, Rosalie, was a washerwoman's daughter. Quiet, poor, pregnant by a traveling salesman she couldn't even name. She came to us with her head down and her belly full and no real future ahead of her. According to scale, she failed every measure. We prepared for the judgment. The infant would not live." Her voice didn't waver, but her hand shook slightly as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a rusted chain, delicate, with a small token at the end, a tiny silver charm in the shape of a circle within a square, and I recognized it from the ledger, from the symbol beside Rosalie's name, and she continued, "But Marguerite," she stopped it. When the baby came out screaming, healthy, perfect, she held him tight and refused to follow the code. She looked at me and said, "This one lives?" I'd decide. I'd never seen anyone defy the process like that. Not once. Not in my whole life. And for a moment I thought she would be punished, cast out. But the others, they were stunned. Maybe ashamed. Maybe they saw something they didn't want to admit. Her eyes glistened, but she did not cry. She smuggled him away that night. Hid him with a priest in Eunice. Forged papers. Gave him a new name. She told everyone the baby died, and Rosalie, well, we gave her enough laudanum to forget, or so we thought. She looked away, her voice faltering for the first time. I tried to forget too, but I never could. And when you came asking, I knew what you were. You're the ripple, the breach, the one who wasn't meant to be. The words hit like a stone, sharp and cold, but not cruel, just true. I wanted to be angry, but all I could feel was the ache of recognition, the understanding that every breath I'd taken, every second of my life, existed because one woman in a line of executioners chose to break the code. Colette reached out then, placing the charm in my hand. "This belonged to your father. Marguerite wore it around her neck until the day she died. You should have it." I clutched it like it might answer the questions still clawing at me, about fate, about legacy, about whether I was meant to bear the guilt of history I didn't choose. "Do you regret it?" I asked her quietly. "Helping." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked back at the river, its surface glinting with the last light of day. "I regret not speaking sooner. I regret every time I stayed silent while another mother bled and begged. I regret believing we were doing God's work. But mostly," she paused, her voice tightening, "I regret that we were never stopped." We sat there as the sun dipped below the trees, casting the bayou in shadow, and I knew that this was the closest I would ever come to justice. Not legal, not official, but intimate, spoken aloud between the only two Bellefontaines left who understood what the name truly meant. And as I rose to leave, charm in hand, I realized that confession alone wasn't absolution, but was a beginning. I didn't sleep the night I returned from the river, not because of fear or grief, but because I could no longer separate myself from the story I'd uncovered. I was no longer a curious descendant unraveling a distant legacy. I was a consequence of one broken commandment. The child spared from ritual execution by a woman who chose instinct over indoctrination. And that truth pulsed through my veins with clarity that refused to dim, and in the silence of the Bellefontaine house, surrounded by relics of family that had taken so many lives in the name of order, I stared at the charm Colette had given me and felt the full, unbearable weight of what it meant. I was the baby who was meant to die, the unrecorded line in the ledger, the untied cord that should have been cut short, and every breath I had ever taken was a defiance against a system that had deemed me unworthy before I was even named. And suddenly every moment of my life, My childhood laughter, my father's stories, my mother's warm voice, was reframed as an act of rebellion, a narrative that only existed because one woman had chosen compassion over code, and the realization made me ache in a way I could not express, not even to myself. And as I held the charm in my chest, I wept not out of sorrow but out of dislocation. The strange sensation of standing inside your own survival and seeing a map that nearly ended you before you began. And I understood now why Marguerite had been silent all her life. Not because she lacked the words, but because there were none that could contain the complexity of what she'd done, of what it meant to protect a life inside a machine built to end them. And I could picture her hands, steady and trembling all at once, holding my infant father, knowing that to let him go would be to uphold the legacy, and to keep him would be to betray it. And choosing betrayal anyway, choosing blood over law, choosing to fracture the lineage so that something new might grow in the cracks. And now, standing in a house where so many decisions were made in shadows and silence, I was the proof that something had broken, that something had been interrupted, and that interruption had a face, a voice, a body, mine. And as the sun rose outside, painting the walls with amber light, I walked room by room and whispered the names of those I'd read in the ledger, the mothers who never got to hold their children, the babies who never got to grow. And finally, when I stood again in the ritual room, I placed a charm on a wooden chair like an offering, not because it would undo anything, but because I needed it to mean something, needed my survival to count not just as luck but as intention. And I whispered aloud what no one in this house had ever dared say before: "You were wrong." And the words didn't echo, they landed soft and final, like dirt on a coffin. And I walked out of the house for the last time knowing that I had been born not by miracle, not by chance, but by choice. And that choice, more than the judgment that had haunted generations before me, was the only thing that deserved to be remembered. I left the Bellefontaine house without looking back, not because I didn't care, but because some places aren't meant to be mourned in real time. They're meant to be carried, stitched into the body like scar tissue. And as I walked away, the silence followed me, not empty or cold, but full, dense, the kind of silence that grows after a scream is finally heard. And in the month that followed, I tried to return to a life that no longer fit, a name that felt too light, too clean, too unblooded, because I knew now that every part of me had been shaped by something I had never chosen. The judgment of women I never met, the mercy of one who defied them, the chance that breathed me into existence. And there is no unlearning that kind of inheritance, no way to unfeel the knowledge that your life exists only because someone broke a sacred rule written in generations of blood. And so I began to write, not for publication, not for praise, but as a reckoning, a witness statement to the archive of whispers I'd uncovered. And in doing so, I realized that my existence, quiet as it had been before all of this, was in itself a kind of protest, a continuation of that rupture my grandmother began when she chose to save rather than sanction. And the more I wrote, the more I understood that I was not just her descendant. I was her echo, the reverberation of a choice that had risked everything to spare one life. And now it was my burden to remember not just the dead, but the silence, not just the rituals, but the resistances that had gone unnamed and unseen. And I returned to the river once more, to scatter the charm into the current not as an act of closure, but as a surrender, because I didn't want to keep carrying the symbol of life meant to end. I wanted to drift, to sink, to find the bottom and rest there, free from the meaning we had, heaped upon it. And as it vanished beneath the water's surface, I spoke aloud for the first time not the name of Bellefontaine, but my own, full, defiant, unbroken. And with that I knew I had begun something new, not by abandoning the past, but by bearing it differently, less like a weight and more like a thread, something I could weave into story, into truth, into voice. And that voice no longer trembled when I said, I was born from silence, but I do not belong to it.